So I'd like to say welcome to everyone who's joining us wherever you are. We're thankful that you're here with us digitally or virtually. And, my goal for this evening is to really have an open-ended conversation. I'm here mainly just to facilitate. I'm really thankful for our panelists who bring both a lot of passion and a lot of experience, both personal and professional, to this issue. And so I'm going to be relying on them to provide all of the information and guidance, and I will be primarily fielding your questions if you have them, and bringing questions to the forefront to help the conversation move along. Before we go any further, let me just open us up with a short word of prayer. God, we're humbled that you would invite us to be a part of what you are doing. And our prayer is simple, that you would give us the grace to be standard bearers of that very same grace. We pray, Lord, that our thoughts would be clear, that our words would be compelling, and God, that the good things of this world, the good things that your Son, Jesus Christ, brought, would become evident in our conversation and in this opportunity. So, Lord, thank you for bringing panelists and attendees together. We pray that this would be a taste of your kingdom coming. Just pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So maybe could we have each of the panelists just take a minute to introduce yourself. You can give us as much of your personal or professional information as you'd like, but I'd also be interested if maybe you could answer the question. Well, I'll leave it there. Tell us as much as you want about yourself. There'll be plenty of time for questions later.
I'll go first, I guess.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, thank you, Nate, and thank you everyone else who's attending virtually. It's definitely an honor to be here and share this conversation space with Mark and ShaCha. My name is Steve Vinson. I work at the University of Michigan. I attend Grace. I'm a member of the Connections team at Grace of Ann Arbor. Like I said, I work at the University of Michigan. I've been in Ann Arbor since 1989. Graduated with a degree in master's, in health administration. Right now, my position is a financial and business analyst, but I work a lot in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space at U of M. So I'm a lead for Michigan Medicine, our health system, and I also chair our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee for my department.
Thanks, Steve. ShaCha, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is ShaCha Geronimo. I actually work at the Wayne State University in the Counseling and Psychological Services. I'm also part of the Wayne State diversity team there. When we talk about race issues, that's always been a passion of mine, especially within the body of Christ. And so about 5 years ago, as I saw the city of Detroit becoming more diverse, specifically our neighborhood becoming more gentrified, I prayed about what to do about that. And so I got together a group of believers from Black, white, and we all through a conference called Facing Race. And from that conference, we developed small groups. So the small groups were supposed to run for 8 weeks. Instead, they went on for 3 years. And from those 2 small groups, multiple small groups grew. Yeah, so when I'm not at Wayne State, I go to churches and other organizations and provide diversity training and counseling and consulting in that way. So I love these topics. So thank you for having me.
I feel really privileged to have you here. Mark.
Yeah, my name is Mark Van Andel. I'm pastor at Hesed Community Church in Detroit. Thankful for our partnership with Grace in many ways. I'm a neighbor of ShaCha, so I'm one of the gentrifiers that ShaCha was speaking about in the community. And I've been part of the facing race conversations there. I got into conversations of thinking about racial justice about 25 years ago, and took a anti-racism course and have been kind of on a learning journey since then, discovering about what God's heart is for racial justice here. And I've learned a lot, but I have a lot yet to learn, and looking forward to learning with this group today.
Great. And my name is Nate Kimball. I'm one of the pastors at Grace Church. So, you know, one of the places I want to start this conversation is exploring the problem. You know, I think that there are some people that would say, I'm not sure we have a race problem in the United States. I'm sure, again, I live in a farming community far outside Ann Arbor. I'm sure most of my neighbors would feel that way. And so, you know, I think we should take a little bit of time to explain the problem. And Mark, something you said actually, I think might be a decent jumping off point. You said racial justice. Can you explain what sort of justice is required, or why justice is required?
Sure. So the concept of race is a social construct. It's created by humans. Obviously, there's different people groups, ethnicities. There's people from all different nations around the world. But race as a concept in terms of dividing people into skin color is a relatively new phenomenon. It's, 600 years old, 600 years old. So that idea was formed for a variety of purposes, but one was to develop intelligence, like to be able to identify which people groups were on a hierarchy. And so as a result, then we had colonization and a variety of race-based assessments that allowed people to oppress other people based on this social construct of race. So this is what makes what has formed the basis of our problem that we exist today. And obviously American history was dotted with that, particularly with regards to colonization, but then also more profoundly with race-based chattel slavery, which produced a system of people as property, and then formed eventually through reform, through wars and battles, has been reformed to the place where just 50 years ago, we started implementing some civil rights movement that started to bring about some elements of legal justice around the issue of race and racial prejudice and segregation. So we've got a long history of racial policies that have created unjust systems in our country. And just in the last 50 years, we've been kind of unpacking some of those things a little bit, but we've got a long ways to go to be able to achieve real equity amongst people and to dismantle the social construct of race, I think is a necessary step. So.
Yeah, this actually brings me back to something that Steve was talking about before the call started officially. And it was interesting because we actually called this workshop Racial Reconciliation. And Steve was kind of like, why did you choose that word? Steve, could you kind of take us back through your thoughts on that again?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nate. So as I saw the topic of racial reconciliation, I just really wanted to think about what that truly meant. So reconciliation, again, if you look at it from a Webster's definition, it means the restoration of a once friendly period of time. So I thought about it from the racial perspective, as Mark just spoke about with respect to the construct of race, and we've never really had a period of time where I would say race relations were in a friendly place. Perhaps with Barack Obama, in his presidency, I thought that we were maybe, and a lot of us thought that we were maybe getting there, right? But then racism was like, gotcha, we're not nearly as far along as we thought, right? And so thinking about reconciliation from the country, America's perspective, I don't think we've been there, and I think we have a ways to go. I'm trying to frame it from an individual perspective. So how do we approach reconciliation from a individual, because there's many types of racism, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. There's individual racism, there's interpersonal racism, there's institutional racism, and systemic racism. So that's really what we're dealing with now. But from an individual perspective, can we come together? Can we talk in a compassionate, open way and have mutual understanding about these concepts via authentic conversation? And I think if we name it, if we name racism and name what it is and recognize it, I think that can start the process towards reconciliation.
Thanks, Steve. ShaCha, I know you're having some internet issues, but is there anything you wanted to add as we talk about racial reconciliation versus justice, or that kind of, I don't know how much of that you were able to hear.
I know we'll probably get into it, but just that it is a gospel issue, and this is something that Christ calls us to, and I think oftentimes we forget that, or it's easy to just focus on, Christ came to restore man's relationship with God, but also cross-culturally, and a big chunk of the Bible is all about how do we get along with people, believers who are different than us. And so yeah, I'll stop there. And I'll just say this too, I apologize for, I never have internet issues, but all of a sudden, of course, I have it now. So if I keep bouncing back and forth, I might just switch devices. So I'm just letting you guys know. I'll be back on.
No
okay.
Problem. So, again, if we're defining the problem, Steve, I think you laid out a pretty solid framework for us to at least start the conversation. You listed four, and you said interpersonal. You're gonna have to name. They were on the top of your head.
Individual, which manifests itself as individual internal thoughts about racism. So I do this better because I'm a different race than this other race. Interpersonal, so that's interactions between folks that could manifest in terms of actions or words. So calling someone a derogatory name, bigotry within folks. And then we talk about institutional racism. So that is discriminatory practices within institutions that manifest into marginalizing various populations. And then we get into systemic, right, which is the big issue right now, and how that manifests across institutions maintained by our society.
That's helpful. That's helpful. I wonder if, as panelists, you could maybe put some feet on some of those things. Again, I understand them conceptually, but if you could maybe say, this is something I've seen, or this is what this sometimes look like, to give us an idea a little bit more of what those are specifically.
I'll take a shot at that. A story I often recount, I may have even shared at Grace before, but when my wife and I owned stock in a family company that was started by her grandfather in the early 1900s. And that produces quarterly dividend checks that come to our house, that's cash money in our pocket. That he started that company when Steve's grandfather wouldn't have had the same opportunity to start that company because of limited education, or limited, because of the segregation that existed in that generation. Limited education, limited access to capital, loans, bank loans, et cetera, limited capacity to build a network across the region or across the Midwest, that this is a Midwest business, just to list a couple of things. So to this day, our family benefits financially from a company that was started when there was racial segregation that was really enforced prior to civil rights movement. So this is a tangible thing where we're getting money from a time that was separate and unequal in our country's time. So that's a tangible thing. That's one thing. But some people will be like, well, I didn't grow up with money, so that doesn't qualify for me. Well, that's fine, but I can still drive any place in our state without any fear of being pulled over because of my skin color. And that's something that is inherently built into our system that allows me to freely come and go wherever I want. I don't even have to conceptually think about, am I Am I safe going here with my family? Am I okay to drive through this town? And that's something that is across the board, whether you're black, white, or sorry, whether you're white poor or whether you're white wealthy, because of generational wealth, those things are still in existence. So that's a couple things that are tangible to my life.
I have a story too, just about how laws are oftentimes put in place that negatively affect people of color. And one story I have is about my mom. Our dog had passed away. And so we called the city to pick up our dog, and they came and they picked up the remains of the dog and took the dog away. A couple of months passed. It was time to renew the dog's license or registration. And my mom didn't renew it, of course.
I think we've lost your audio, ShaCha.
When they, talked to her, they told her that she had a warrant out for her arrest for harboring an unlicensed dog. So we had to go to court to defend, and I had my speech ready because I was fired up, and the judge looks at it and says, "This is ridiculous. You can go." And it just infuriated.
ShaCha, we've lost your audio again.
Can you hear me now?
Now we've got you back.
Okay. What's the last part you heard me say?
That the judge threw out the
yeah, he threw out the case, but my brother, who's about the same complexion as Steve, I just feared, like, if that was my brother in that situation where the cop pulled him over and said he had a warrant out for his arrest, what that situation would have looked like. They let my mother go because she was an older woman, but that's a case of where laws oftentimes are put in place that just negatively impact communities of color. And for me, like growing up, I've just always had this, I don't know, like this weight on me that if a cop is ever behind me, that they're going to find something on me, even though I have not broken the law. It's just something that just kind of weighs on us. And so that's an example of, I guess, institutional or structural racism that is often shown in our law system.
Yeah, I also have a DWB, driving while black story. I got pulled over when I was around 25, driving home. I got pulled out of the car. I was patted down. My car was searched. Asked the police officer why I was pulled over. They said obstructed view. So I had a fragrance tree hanging from my rearview mirror. I was not given a ticket. I was let go. Fast forward 25 years later, my son's driving to school. He goes to Butler, or he just graduated, went to Butler in Indianapolis on 23, got pulled over. He was driving in the fast lane, was not passing, wasn't speeding, wasn't passing. He got pulled over. He's got no issues in terms of his record, pulled out of his car, put in the police car for 15 minutes while they ran his information and whatever, let him go. And even worse, his mother was behind him. She pulled over behind the cop car. They made her move to the off ramp because there was nothing wrong with her vehicle. Of course, she was concerned about her son's safety. That story still sticks with me, everyone, because I just, as much as I wanted to be there with my son to protect him, knowing what I know now and going through what I've gone through, I wonder how I would have reacted in that situation, in that scenario. And then where would that have put me and my son in terms of our safety? So yeah, we all have those. When you talk about folks of color, I shouldn't say we all, but a lot of us have stories of that sort of systemic racism.
I think one other thing that you mentioned earlier when we were talking, Steve, was that even the COVID-19 crisis has been experienced differently in communities. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen there?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure a lot of folks have seen, the news reports about the health disparities and the disproportionate rate of COVID impacting communities of color. So when we talk about, again, systemic racism and how it's manifesting in terms of COVID rates, one example would be housing, right? And we do know that folks of color tend to live in more dense communities, but why is that and how did that occur? So one of the things that I'm looking at with respect to housing, and I know Mark and I have talked about this before, from a systemic perspective, is redlining, for example, is a practice that was started in maybe the 30s and it was a government program. The FHA made it more difficult for folks of color to get housing in suburban communities and somewhat force those individuals to live in the more inner city areas. We had a situation actually in Grosse Pointe that I just learned about. Grosse Pointe had a point system where folks would get basically by a private investigator, they would get rated based on social identity characteristics. What is their religion? What is their accent? How do they look? What are their friends like? What's their academic achievement? They would get points relative to that in order to get to live in this affluent neighborhood. And based on your acceptability due to your social identity, that would determine what the score is needed to live in that neighborhood. So those of Northern European descent, whether it's German, French, didn't have to go through this rating process. If you were of Polish descent, you would have to get 55 out of 100. If you were of Southern European descent, 65. Jewish, 85. Folks of color and Asian were not eligible to go through this rating process. Those types of systemic things have been happening, which has created the dense populations, it's created suburban populations and the segregation between folks of color and white. And so that's a systemic thing. Those are institutional policies across our country and the fabric of what we've been built on the last centuries, several centuries.
So we've gotten a question about fleshing out a little bit more the difference between institutional and systemic racism. But I think the question that I'd like to explore is, does racism flow, if you have systemic, institutional, interpersonal, individual, does racism flow one way or the other, or are they all interwoven? Does that question make sense? Because in some ways, Steve, what you were describing started off as essentially, it sounds like institutional racism, where the city itself was saying, hey, this is what we're putting in place. And that has turned into kind of a systemic issue where you have populations of Black people or people of color kind of concentrated. So maybe that's not a good question, but I think that might help answer the attendee's question.
I think that's a great question. I want to give others a chance to answer, but I think that's a great question. I think it starts with individuals, quite frankly, and then it starts from the individual to a house, and a house to a street, and a street to a neighborhood, and a neighborhood to a city, and on and on. And so I think it grows from there. I think you pose a challenging question. There's an author. His name is Ibram X. Kendi. He wrote a book, which I recommend everyone try to get. It's sold out right now, but it's How to Be Anti-Racist. And he asked that very question. Did racism start with the policies? And then we came up with the race construct? Or did it start with racist individuals and then that were created policies? And I'm not sure where I lean on that, to be honest with you, Nate. I think it's one of those chicken or egg and go either way from my perspective. But I think, what we can control as individuals, I think that's very important. And I know someone asked a question about the difference between institutional and systemic, and I just want to address that real quick. When you talk about institutional, that is what goes on within that specific institution. So for example, hiring policies. When you look at resumes, for example, those who have Black sounding names are 50% less likely to get a call back than those who have white sounding names. So that is an institutional policy. Are we training folks to mitigate bias in the hiring process? And how are we diversifying our teams, our work staff, those sorts of things? So I think that's the difference. And we're talking about systemic. It's on a much larger level, and I think it just grows as you I think spread out from individual to interpersonal to institutional to systemic. That's my perspective.
ShaCha, I saw you nodding your head when Steve was talking about it starts with an individual to a house to a neighborhood. Has that been your experience?
I mean, that's why I believe it starts with an individual, because I mean, racism is just sin, and so that's embedded in us. And the people that have the power to make the policies, they make it based off of these biases that they have, whether they know it intentionally or unintentionally. It just kind of gets spread and moved on up the ladder. So I personally believe it starts with the individual, and it just gradually grows and grows, and then it festers everything. So.
And then I think what's critical about that is once it gets baked into the system, suddenly it just becomes normative. So we've got a normative preferential whiteness or preference for whiteness in our country. That's just kind of like, that's normal. And I think we've all had these blinders over our eyes towards this preferential treatment that happens in our country. Even folks of color can have blinders towards the white supremacy that's kind of baked into our national ethos. And so I think the systemic stuff starts to allow the interpersonal stuff to just kind of perpetuate and continue without any questioning of it, because you're just like, oh, well, that's the way that it is. So when people start calling for defunding of the police, for instance, to give a real practical example, we're like, oh, we just assume that the way that the policing is done now is the correct way to do it. And so when questions are asked about those kinds of systemic things that are like, wait, the police have never have the police been favorable towards the Black community. So when we start questioning how do we do this differently? It's like, oh, well, we can't do it differently. We're doing it the right way right now because it's gone on so long. So those kinds of questions are just kind of, I think it goes up and down, but once it gets baked into the system, then it's like, oh, it's really hard for the individual to be conscious of it from that point forward.
We had somebody chat in a question. Is racism a white issue only, or does it happen in other communities? And I don't want this to be the whole discussion, but I think it's a question on people's minds.
So can only white people be racist? Is that the implication? So the way that I define this is racism as a definition is prejudice plus power. So it's the combination of those two that creates the racist thing. So we're all prejudiced. So Steve and ShaCha could be prejudiced too, but their prejudice doesn't have the historical context of power structures of oppression that have been oppressive towards their own people for years. So that's how I kind of define it. So anybody can be prejudiced, and we probably all are. I mean, that's part of what it means to be human, is to judge people, and we judge people based on external things rather than on really seeking to see the image of God in them, in every person. So I think that prejudicial piece is one element, but when it's been when the institutions and the systems have been built around this preferential treatment or this prejudicial treatment, that's when it starts to get oppressive and ongoing and continues to perpetuate. So you guys can chime in and help me out with that, clarify.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Steve, ShaCha, before we move on.
I feel like you hit it right on the nail. So yeah, I agree.
I would agree. This actually is a pretty good segue into another topic that I think we're maybe going to discuss when we talk about folks who, the Black versus African American issue, right? And I know that there is discussion with a group called ADOS. It's the American Descendants of Slaves, I believe is the name of the group. So there's tension between that group and others who may be Black but do not descend from American slaves. And so the tension is that individuals who be first, second generation that come from African nations, that come from Jamaica, Haiti, whomever, are basically taking away the resources, which could be considered scarce in some aspects from those who descend from slaves. And so there's a lot of tension within the Black community. And so when you ask, can I would agree with Mark, can those of color be racist? If you look at it from a power perspective, I would agree with Mark 100%. But there can be prejudice. There can be anti-Black, I guess, and anti-minority feelings, and it can manifest itself in a racist way, if that makes sense.
I appreciate the clarification. I do. So I want to talk about the problem. The problem, we could probably spend the next hour and a half talking about the problem, because it's so far-reaching, and at every level there's multiple conversations to have. But I'd also like to talk about, how do we begin to address, how do we begin to combat, how do we begin to bring justice? I guess I'll leave it pretty open-ended, and provide follow-up questions as we get into it.
Let me jump in there. I just want to follow up. Phil had asked a question in the comment or in the chat about if racism is prejudice plus power, then are Black people racist in African countries? And just to clarify, that's a legitimate question. The power dynamic, if it's used to oppress people based on certain, the question is about oppression. Like, is there a system of oppression in an African country, and is it based on race? So what we've got here in the United States and is more of a race-based oppressive system. And but in other countries, there's still oppression. Oppression happens all over the place. Whenever you got people with power, they oppress people. It's just natural human. That's sin. That's our own tendency to elevate ourselves and pridefully make ourselves higher than others. So it can happen in other places. We just have a unique form of that here because it's race-based. This social construct of race has been formed to be able to keep certain people down and to elevate other people. So hopefully that's helpful, Phil. I just wanted to respond to that. But just in terms of solution-based, kind of shifting towards solution, I think oftentimes what happens, I'll speak for myself, when I get in an argument with my wife and I really wrong her in some real tangible, hard way, I want to be like, okay, I'm sorry. What can we do now? What can we move on? And I really want to move on because I don't want to sit with the pain that I've caused her and be present to her pain. And I feel like oftentimes in this conversation about race, once we start to know, we don't even know the depth of the pain that we've caused, but once we start to know the pain, we're like, oh crap, I want to get out of this quickly. So just tell me, how do we fix it? And I think oftentimes the journey needs to be sitting with someone in their pain, or sitting and being present to the pain first before we start to go running towards trying to fix something, because we can try and fix something, throw money at stuff, we can try and make all these solutions. But I think that sitting with the pain and lamenting the pain and really being present to it is the first step. So I think lament and grief and being in solidarity with the grief and the pain that we've caused is a great first step.
I also think taking the necessary steps to educate yourself and not be dependent upon your Black brothers and sisters in doing that. There are multiple programs out there that help white people kind of understand their role in this. And so one is doing your own work. And her name is Melanie, and I forgot the last name, but that is one program that's out there, as well as Be the Bridge. They have a white intensive course that I went through with one of my white friends, and it is brilliant. It's online. So I would recommend start reading books. Another book is White Awake, to educate yourself on, okay, because on where you are and how to process through it so that you don't become paralyzed from the pain and everything that you're taking in, but also that you have the steps in knowing how to engage people cross-culturally as well. So I would say just educate yourself.
Yeah, and I would like to also add, I think, I agree with what has been said, but I think we have to, we can't, I guess, freeze people in time. And so what I mean by that is I just received a text last Tuesday from an ex-colleague of mine. We had an argument. She's a white woman. We had an argument about 2 years ago regarding kneeling during the national anthem. So she comes from a military family. We disagreed wholeheartedly on that. During this quarantine, she said she's been reading a lot. She's been, to ShaCha's point, educating herself, doing some self-reflection. And she texted me and she said, I understand and I get it now. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's what she would do or advocate for someone to do, but at least she's now understanding why folks are kneeling, why the Black Lives Matter movement is important for us. So we can't freeze folks in time. We have to meet them where they're at. We have to be open and have open, vulnerable conversations, as Mark said. And we have to be able to, as I mentioned earlier, name it. If we can't be afraid to talk about it. And I know race and racism is uncomfortable to a lot of folks. But it's just like any other addiction. You have to name it and recognize that it's an issue before you start the process of working on it.
So, ShaCha, you mentioned something that I've heard several times, and I personally would appreciate some clarification. In what ways might white people be asking Blacks to do the work for them? Can you help me understand that a little bit more?
Yes, and let me just answer Denise's question. Her name is actually Melanie Morrison. I just looked up really quick. I'm the one who does the doing your own work. And she's from Michigan, so she's right here. You can have her come out. We've had her come to our staff and do our training as well. So what I mean by that is I have had it where people have taken or tried to make me a project and said, hey, can you tell me about all your horrific experiences that you've been through? They didn't use that language, but pretty much wanted to use, and very unintentionally, use the trauma of being a Black woman to help further their understanding. And that's a vulnerable place to put somebody in, especially someone that you barely know and they barely know you. And so that's what I mean. Oftentimes, and Mark said it, when white people get in these spaces, they want to do something. And one of the first
we looks like we
lost your audio.
Yeah, ShaCha's audio.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay,
we can.
So again, my recommendation is, and just sit by yourself and try to educate yourself for a minute before you reach out. And so Black people know, they know if they become a project. And so one of the things I often train or encourage white people to do, once you get to the point where you're reaching out or trying to develop cross-cultural relationships, is just learn how to be with people instead of firing them with 1,000 questions. Develop a relationship from the things that you mutually are have in common, and just let the relationship kind of gradually grow. As it gradually grows, the issues of race will come up, and then that person will feel more comfortable addressing that with you versus, just answering a lot of questions so that you can, grow. So.
Steve, I also saw you nodding pretty vigorously at that question. Do you have any additional thoughts?
I do. We've talked about this a lot at Michigan Medicine recently. Folks tend to think that these sorts of conversation and issues need to be started, at least initiated, by folks of color or those DEI folks. I literally had someone say, I hope you guys have conversation about that. And they were talking about a Black person, but you folks that live in that diversity, equity, and inclusion world. And that burden is felt quite often by folks of color. I've been thinking about this recently, about this current crisis of racism and how it intersects with all the other things we have going on, right? We have the economic recovery financial crisis. We have the COVID health crisis. We have a mental health crisis. We have an infodemic crisis, which is sharing misinformation. And all of those things are going on right now that all of us are experiencing. But I think what ShaCha is saying, and I agree with, is that folks have to understand, non-Black folks, non-folks of color, is that we're all experiencing that, but folks of color are also experiencing racism, which is always there, always present. So asking us to now deal with rectifying and remedying racism and systemic racism on top of the backdrop of everything else that we have is a difficult burden for us to continue to carry. So this is an issue that needs everyone's input and everyone's solidarity to move forward.
Good, I appreciate that. I wonder, is it different? ShaCha, you started this kind of conversation talking about how this is a gospel issue. Can you expand on that a little bit? Why you feel like it's so critical for people of faith to own this conversation?
Yes. Well, when we look in the Bible, especially Ephesians, it talks about the mystery of the gospel. And the mystery was that through the resurrection that Christ unified the Gentiles and the Jews, two people groups that were pretty much at odds with each other. And then I'm also reminded of Jesus' prayer before he goes to the cross, where he prays 5 times that his church would be unified. And that's so that the world would know. And so it is a gospel issue. Like most of the New Testament, again, I said it earlier, is to the church about how do we get along through our differences. And so I feel like because there has been such a racial divide in the church, that has hindered our witness to the world. In some ways, the world is far ahead of us in this. And so what I'm seeing right now, my prayer is that this is God reunifying the church back together. And so I've just seen it, and I'll just say one example is when I was in university, at Wayne State University, we had the most diverse student group on campus. We also had the largest student group at that time, because it was many years ago. It was not really common to see people engaging cross-culturally like that outside of the classroom. But because we genuinely loved each other and genuinely worked out our issues, we had a lot of arguments, but we said we're going to stay committed to the relationship with one another. That student group grew. And again, it was the largest student group on campus, but I think that's because people got a taste of heaven, and people got to see the love of Christ through this huge group of students from all these different ethnicities and backgrounds, genuinely enjoying each other and loving each other. And they got to see the love of Christ through that. And so I just believe when we come together across cultural boundaries, it's something that's attractive to the non-believer when they see that genuine love that is crossing those boundaries. So I do believe it's a gospel issue. And I think we need to spend more time on that, on how do we engage one another in our differences.
Mark, how about you as a pastor? I feel like you might have a thought on this.
Well, the thing that comes to mind, I love what ShaCha says about the church coming together in unity through Christ, but I'm also thinking about the Old Testament passages of the prophets who were railing on the people of God because they didn't care for the poor and the oppressed, because their heart was not for justice. Solomon gets chided because he started using slave labor when the Israelites were commanded, you've been slaves, don't do that to somebody else now, don't enslave other people. So I feel like the Old Testament themes of justice is the significant conversation for us to be thinking about. I use racial justice rather than racial reconciliation, because justice is a gospel word to me. God's heart is for justice, clearly. And what we have in our country right now is an unjust system. It's unjustly preferential towards people with lighter skin tones and European descendants. And that injustice, the church should be leading in that. And the church should be striving to be able to find out ways about how do we enact God's justice. The biblical story that I love about this is Zacchaeus. When Zacchaeus gets to really meet Jesus and he looks into Jesus' eyes across the table, he's like, I have done wrong. He's convicted of his sin of overcharging people and taxing people unrighteously. And he goes back and he repays, according to the Old Testament law, he repays people what he's owed them. So he is fighting for justice. He's had this relationship with Jesus, and his relationship with Jesus causes him then to pour out and to bring about justice from the injustice and the sin of his oppression from previous. So I think those things show me that God's heart is for justice, and that we as followers of Christ should be walking in that same pattern.
That's good. So $64,000 question. I mean, how do we do that? Somebody asked a question like, if it feels like racism starts at the individual level and works its way up, is that how we also begin to address it, or are systemic and institutional laws and things like that our first step?
I'll jump on that, Steve, if you don't mind. I feel like it's a both and, but I feel like my ability to see the ways that systemic issues are impacting people of color has been only through the lens of relationship and proximity. So as long as I'm at a distance from people and I don't have real relationship, it's hard for me to see those things. Now, all of us saw that with this situation in Minneapolis. We could all see there was something really broken there. That didn't take proximity to understand. But proximity helps for the long term, the long haul of unpacking all the ways in which this is implicit, not just in the policing system, but throughout many of our institutions and even our churches. So how do we unpack that apart from proximity? It's really hard. So I would encourage people to draw near to people and listen and learn and be present to that as you're pursuing those things that helps you to see through the lens of how people are being oppressed in tangible ways.
I would agree with Mark. I think both are needed and necessary. I can't say that everyone can influence both, but to the extent that I think one of the things we can do is acknowledge our privilege, and that can be a sensitive, dicey topic, and there's sometimes pushback when you talk about that. And from my perspective, there's no need for an apology for privilege. But I think acknowledging it is a first step to having some of those conversations. And I just thought to myself, as we were coming into the situation today, because there is a lot of pushback when we talk about white privilege. Would there be the same pushback if I said to someone, well, you have ability privilege when compared to someone who has a disability, right? Would there be the same kind of like, whoa, I can't believe you're saying that to me, defensive nature, if that were said? And so I just think if we get to a point where we can all say, yes, I have privilege, and it goes beyond race, right? It's class privilege, there's gender privilege, there's lots of different privileges that I think we all can acknowledge. Then we can start to move forward and say, oh yeah, well, I have a privilege here. Maybe I can utilize this to help with some of the inequities that we are seeing.
So how do we begin? So if it starts at an individual level, and if proximity is one of the ways that we address this, how do we go about that without it beginning to feel like, how are we purposeful without, again, putting the burden back on our Black brothers and sisters to be in relationship with us so that we can learn what we need to learn? I mean, again, I feel like I'm trying to navigate Jello a little bit into, I don't think there's an easy definition, but I do think that that still feels like a question for some people.
So I think one thing that you can do is what I've been doing is just creating small groups or the space for people to come together and have these discussions, because we don't have a lot of spaces where you can really be honest and be ignorant, but still be loved, and ask those tough questions that you just genuinely don't know. So I think whatever church, like just having I know most churches have small groups. So if there was one small group that was just committed to being diverse and studying what does the Bible biblically say about walking out racial justice and studying that, I think that's a step, because people who are interested in that, whether they're whatever color they are, they would come and it wouldn't be a burden. So some of us, like myself, although sometimes it can be a burden, we enjoy this. We consider ourselves bridge builders. And so we enjoy those opportunities to be able to engage other people in this conversation. So I just said, create the space that people can come and continue to engage in this conversation.
Good. It reminds me, ShaCha, of our first conversation. I don't know if you perceived it, but I was super nervous because I was like, I have some questions that I want to ask, and I don't know if I'm going to piss her off if I say this, but you were very gracious. So I'm thankful. But I experienced that personally, you know, and I grew up in the actual city of Detroit. I lived there for my first 10 to 12 years, always been a part of multiracial, multi-ethnic churches, and still find myself feeling like I'm on uncertain footing sometimes. And so I appreciate your word of grace.
Hey, Nate, if you don't mind, I'm sorry if I cut you off, Mark. I just wanted to expand on that a little bit in terms of building allyship. And I think, you know, there are different levels of being an ally. So there's a model, a construct that we use at the University of Michigan where folks go along that continuum. The first level is opposed. And there are folks who are just absolutely opposed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and will never believe in it and are very resentful of the fact that we actually spend money on that. Then there are folks who are in the observer and then learner phase. And those are folks that sort of get it, but they really want to learn more. And I think those are the folks that we really, right now, we're seeing are becoming allies across this country in terms of marching, in terms of being in, you know, acting in solidarity with folks who are really acknowledging that we have issues and marching across this country. And then you have an ally, ambassador, and advocate. So those are folks, and to Scott, you know, Winter, he asked a question about Ibram X. Kendi and doing things that kind of make white people feel better, right? I'll do a couple of hashtags. I'll hold a couple of Black Lives Matter signs. I'll go on a couple of protests, and now I'm good, right? I'm not a racist. That can't be me. So for folks, and we call that performance allyship, right? You're kind of doing it. It's very surface, but it can be fleeting once the issue goes away. So for folks who really want to take it to the next level, want to be allies, ambassadors, and advocates, there are lots of things you can do. You can start supporting Black businesses, like Mark said. Engage in proximity to minorities, vote not just at a national level, but vote at a local level and a state level. Activate yourself. So those are the sorts of things I think are next level that you can move beyond just saying I've done a couple of these surface level things and move on to the different levels of being an ally.
That's good. That's helpful. That's really helpful. So we've had, I want to mention for those of you that are watching, if you have questions, you have a couple options in which you can present those. We might not be able to get to everything, but there's a Q&A at the bottom. There's also a chat option. And if you put stuff there, we'll try to address it. We've been talking for about an hour, and so I don't want to go too much longer, but I also want to mention that we're going to compile a set of resources. I asked each of the panelists to put some resources together that they think would be beneficial for our own education. And so we will send that out. Basically, if you registered for this call, you'll get a follow-up email with a list of some of those. So can we talk for a minute about the church, for example? What role does the church play, as we've talked about individuals, as an institution in terms of addressing the issue of racism?
I guess I'm the pastor. I should probably speak to that, but I think that people will often ask me, like, okay, does this mean I have to go to an all-black church, or do I have to? I live in this community. This is where I'm connected to, and I think that it doesn't have to be that way. But I think that churches should be mindful of how they can be active. So churches have organized around issues like abortion for years and done different things that have been critical to advocating for an anti-abortion stance. And I truly believe that to be truly pro-life, you should be against something like police brutality. And so how can the church organize around a holistic pro-life approach towards foster care and adoption, towards against police brutality, against other things? These are not, we see them as political issues, but we don't have a problem with the abortion issue as a political issue and fighting for that. But how can we start to see some of these other things as gospel issues that need political advocacy, that need us to organize and work towards just solutions? So I think we get scared about politics, but there's some things that we just don't, we feel like are more political than they are, and or that we're scared of. And so I just think that the church needs to be mindful of how we can have a holistic approach to the advocacy that needs to take place.
What about church leadership? What role do you think church leaders have, whether they're small group leaders or pastors?
Yeah, well, if you're an Anglo, you need to do learning. You need to get on a learning track. So one of the crazy parts about this is sometimes, like you mentioned, Nate, sometimes white folks are scared to talk about race. But the ironic part is Black folks talk about race all the time because it impacts every facet of their lives. So they're always talking about this. So most of the time, my experience has been, especially hopefully within the church where there's gracious people who are shaped in the character of Christ, that when I say, I'm really trying to be a learner here, can you help me? Or I'm really struggling with this, can you help me? I feel like that is an open door towards conversation. So I think that leaders particularly need to educate themselves because they're shaping people within the congregation, and do it from a Christian perspective. You don't have to say, I'm buying all critical theory as I adapt into this. You can say, no, I really believe that we're shaped as humans through we understand the brokenness of sin and the ways that that's impacted all of us. And we're not just trying to fight to see who's most oppressed, but we're actually trying to say, how can we help set people free and bring deliverance and freedom and hope to other people through our just actions? So those are a few thoughts.
I also think it doesn't help it helps to figure out how to build a cross-cultural relationship. So if a church can begin, or the leadership of that church can begin building a relationship with another church that's cross-culturally different than that church, and then perhaps do some activities together, but it does need to start with the leadership. So, and I say that with a white pastor or white leader kind of coming underneath the minority leader of another church and kind of being a mentor, or mentee of that leadership to learn more. And then bringing, like I said before, doing activities together as churches so that the relationships can begin to build. Because a lot of this, it's easy just to ignore when you don't know anybody that is impacting. So the more relationships you gain cross-culturally, the more compassion that you have to these issues.
The questions are starting to roll fast and furious, which is good. Let's start with this one, because this is something that we talked about ahead of time. Someone asked, is it possible to support Black Lives Matter as a statement and idea, but not the Black Lives Matter movement? If so, how can we do that well? I think one of the first things that might be helpful would be to describe, and ShaCha, you mentioned this to me, that there's a difference between the message of Black Lives Matter and the movement. Maybe if one of you could speak to that difference a little bit, because that was news to me, to be honest.
Well, I'll just say, yeah. So the message of Black Lives Matter is Black Lives Matter. And so a lot of times when people say that, there's an offense that's had, and the gut reaction is to say, well, white lives matter too. And that's not what we're saying. And so we're not saying white lives doesn't matter because Black lives matter. We're just saying, well, I saw a meme on Facebook, which I thought really summed it up. And it was just saying, like, saying all lives matter instead of Black lives matter is like telling the fire department to come to my block and water all the houses because all houses matter, right? But there's only one house that's on fire. So I say that to say all lives matter, but because of the damage that has been done to the Black community, like, it needs to be said that Black lives matter. So a way to support that is, and it's kind of been said before, support Black organizations, support the Black organizations that are on the ground, that are doing the work, whether they are Christian or not. And they don't have to be, they could be, like, I know, well, just any organization that's doing making a positive impact in a community of color, I think is a way to support Black lives, whether it's financially or volunteering. So.
I would agree with that, and just would like to add on, just historically, from a social justice perspective, from a media perspective, from a law enforcement perspective, Black lives have not mattered. And that's exactly what we're seeing with these recent incidents with respect to George Floyd, with respect to even the young man that got shot, I think it was in Atlanta this weekend at the Wendy's. We're seeing instance after instance. And I think the thing with the Black Lives Matter movement is not just the absolute disregard for life, but also the lack of consequences to the individuals who have taken that life. And so that's really one of the things that the Black Lives Movement is trying to enforce is, where are the consequences for disregard for Black lives? And that's really, I think, the heart of the movement.
I would just add to that too, the Black Lives Matter movement. I know a lot of Christians have a hard time getting behind the movement of that because of the positional stance that they take. Unfortunately, they've formed because the church hasn't risen up as a movement to try and promote biblical values regarding the justice issues in our country. And so what we saw in the civil rights movement was the church was active at differing levels, obviously, but the Black church particularly was fighting this fight. And so there was a moral aspect to that movement that we're lacking right now. But to say, well, I won't join the Black Lives Matter movement doesn't mean that you shouldn't advocate for Black lives to matter or for justice, for and equity for people.
So we just got a follow-up question about that. Someone said, I'm confused about why people won't support the entire movement. Can one of you speak to why that might be the case, what people are reacting against?
I haven't done a ton of study, but I know some conservative leaning folks have some problems with what they might deem as leftist kind of policy changes or so forth. So I don't know enough to be able to speak to specific issues, but I know that I've heard some of my conservative friends who have those kinds of questions about the political ramifications of that movement's stances.
I'm not sure why either, to be honest, but I think ShaCha spoke to that a little bit earlier about all lives matter or blue lives matter, right? You'll hear that said as well. Again, with respect to blue lives matter, though, going back to the consequences, right? If someone takes the life of a law enforcement officer, typically there are consequences to that. In addition to that, being a police officer is a choice. Someone's color is not. And so I think to conflate those two and to do a compare and contrast is a mistake. Obviously, blue lives matter and all lives matter as well. And all those things can be true at once. But we're talking about consequence, and we're talking about something that is not controllable. Someone's social identity is not a choice.
It seems like part of it, one of the core concepts is acknowledging that there's a problem. And it does seem like that has the white church or we've been slow to acknowledge that there is a problem, and saying Black Lives Matter, the core of the issue is saying, look, the reason we need to say this is because we haven't been treating our Black brothers and sisters like their lives do matter. And that's what I heard you say, Steve, is that's not the case with the police. We demonstrate that blue lives matter. We demonstrate that white lives matter, and we haven't with Blacks specifically. Mark, you mentioned that you felt some pushback on Black Lives Matter as a movement from conservatives. Can we talk, this is a can of worms, but it's a question that somebody raised. Can we talk about the politics of race a little bit?
Sure. Politics, in my mind, is just a way that we organize to try and solve societal issues, right? And I think we do that both locally and nationally. And I think, ironically, the local stuff is what impacts us the most. So one of the challenges of police reform is that there's not very many federal standards for how policing is done. It's all decided on local communities. And so each local community builds their own training and so forth, and they might lean into some national stuff, but our local politics affect how we live into this. So I think the challenge is we see through this lens of our politics. So it's almost like I'm a Republican or a Democrat before I'm a Christian, or I'm a Republican or a Democrat before I'm a brother or sister. And so, and this is due to the polarity in our media right now. And trust me, the media are making mad cash right now based on how our world is divided, because it sells based on this polarization. So follow the money, see where it goes. That's really a whole nother issue. But that kind of starts to fuel this. The financial resources that are being pumped into this starts to develop this polarization that produces more revenue. Anyway, economics is always a major issue in this. But I think regarding politics, we need to be able to say, okay, we can all agree, or we can disagree about how to solve a problem. Like less government intervention is one approach, or more government intervention is another approach, right? That's the solution to the problem. But I think we don't even know what the problem, or we haven't established what the problem is in our country. So I think the awareness of what the problem is, that there is this system of race inequity and oppression that's built into our country, that's where we need to start. And then we can start to have disagreements about politics, but let's not rush to politics and say, well, more government intervention here is going to be twisted. I'll give you an example. One of my friends is a physician. He said, if I go into the hospital in northern Michigan, it has so many standards across the board federally that the hospital in northern Michigan is just as good as a hospital in Detroit in many ways. It's just as clean. It's got just as much regulation because the federal intervention, but we're just not accustomed to federal intervention in some of these areas with regards to race. So I think that we need to be mindful of what is the problem, and then we can build on solutions. That's a long-winded, rambling answer, but I'm trying to say it's not left or right. It's trying to find what the problem is first.
And be more concerned to solving the problem than perhaps to party loyalty or a party line.
Definitely.
Hey, Nate, I just wanted to address one of the questions. It looks like Ian said some concerns with the Black Lives Movement might be their stance on homosexuality and transgenderism, for example. And I'm not sure where that comes from. Literally on their website, it says, we affirm the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, undocumented folks with records, women, all black lives along the gender spectrum. So that's literally on their website. So if there's information being spread that they are against homosexuality and transgenderism, I'm not aware of that. And so this again points to that infodemic crisis that I was talking about, and what's being spread and what can we confirm as truth and not truth. So I just think we have to be careful about that as we're talking in these spaces.
Steve, I would say that the Christians, the more conservative Christians, would not be in favor of affirming of queer or trans lives. And so that, I'm not saying that that's what I advocate. I'm just saying that some conservative Christians are not in favor of affirming that kind of sexual behavior.
I would think that's probably accurate. would think that's probably accurate. So, you know, people are asking for podcasts, books, etc., resources. I'll say again, if you signed up for this webinar, we'll make sure that you get an email with a list of all those and links. We'll send that out as soon as we can, but we will make sure that you have some of those in your hands. As we kind of wrap up, I'm wondering, especially to our panelists, are there parts of this conversation that maybe we didn't cover, or did you come in saying, man, I really hope that we get a chance to address this particular issue or facet? I want to make sure that we have time for that, as much as we've made time for other people's questions.
I would just say, please don't let my ineloquence or my inability to communicate clearly keep you from doing more research on this or seeking it out. Or if you sense some political leaning that would create a bias that you think is unhealthy in me, please don't let that keep you from pursuing what I believe is God's heart for racial justice.
Yeah, I would just say, just get comfortable being uncomfortable as you pursue this, because there will be moments where you feel uncomfortable. There will be moments where you will offend people, where you will anger people. Be comfortable with that and be quick to make amends. And that's okay. That's part of the learning process. So I always say, just be comfortable knowing that you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. Again, the best people to learn from, white people should really learn from white people when it comes to race. You can learn from Black people too, but start off learning from white people. Like Jane Elliott has tons of videos and books that you can learn from as well. And I would just say, don't give up. Please, stay consistent in this. As a Black believer, I don't have a choice not to have this conversation, not to discuss it. And so it does hurt my heart when I see my other brothers and sisters that are white not acknowledge the pain that the Black people are going through. And so we have the answer. Christ has destroyed the dividing wall. So we know that up here, but in our hearts, there's some type of disconnect, and our feet are definitely disconnected from that. And so I would just say, as you learn, move in what you're learning and living that out, and allow God to move your feet to be a bridge builder cross-culturally, but also to fight injustice and be an anti-racist. So.
Yeah, I would just add to that, I'm encouraged by, there's a lot of times and spaces when I'm sad and disheartened by what we're seeing, but I'm also encouraged by the solidarity that we're seeing across this country. There's a poem that I just read recently by Langston Hughes, and the poem is called "Let America Be America Again." So I know I'm probably getting some side eyes right now, but it's a different message. And so it is a poem that basically talks about the ideal and the principle of America. And so the last three lines are, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. And so I think there's power in those last three lines, is that there is hope. And at some point, that's really what my background is about. If you can see that's a bunch of Black medical students on a slave plantation in Louisiana. And if those individuals and their ancestors can overcome centuries of degradation and discrimination, and learn to the point where they can be trained to help people heal, then there is hope for our society. And we have to lean into that positive and hope that we can get to that egalitarian space that we all want.
Well, I want to say again to all of you that are watching or listening, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. And to our panelists, again, thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for gracing us with your presence this evening. ShaCha, I was wondering if maybe you would be willing to close us out in prayer.
Absolutely. God, we thank you for this space to be able to come together and dialogue about your heart for justice, your heart for racial reconciliation. We thank you, God, that you are a God of diversity and that you did that on purpose, and that it is your heart that your body would be unified, God. And so we pray that you would be with Grace Church as they continue to delve deeper into these conversations and these issues, God. I pray that you would give them wisdom, that you would give them the patience to endure in this learning, that there is not a destination, but that it is a lifelong journey of learning and growing. And God, I pray that you would be glorified in this, that a lot of fruit will come out of this, God. And I just continue to pray for revival for your church, that you would bring unity, God. Thank you for everyone that has come tonight and listened to us, God. And I just thank you for all this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks
Amen.
again, everyone. Expect an email with a list of resources, and please don't let this be the last time that we have this conversation as individuals, as a church. God bless you all. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Mhm.